This girl's mother hadn't washed her daughter's hair in years, and what they found in it was so terrifying that they called the police immediately. Susan, a frail 9-year-old girl, always wore her hair in an impossibly tight bun, so tight that it looked almost painful. No one had ever seen her without it. Not her classmates, not her teachers, not even her neighbors. Her mother, an aloof and distant woman, never seemed to care for Susan's appearance, and as the years passed, her daughter's hair had become a tangled, matted mystery. Whispers filled the school hallways. Why does she never take it down? Does she even wash it? The other children laughed at her, calling her spider nest and the witch's doll, but Susan never reacted. She just walked past them, her face pale and her fingers often scratching, always scratching at her scalp. Then the headaches began. At first, it was a dull ache, like tiny needles pricking her skull. Then came the migraines so fierce they blurred her vision, accompanied by an unbearable, crawling itch beneath her bun. "Mom, please, my head hurts so much," Susan begged, tears streaming down her face. But her mother dismissed her with a wave of her hand. "You're just being dramatic. It's just dandruff. Stop whining," she scoffed. Susan stopped complaining after that. She simply endured until the day she collapsed. It happened in class. One moment, she was staring at her textbook, her eyes glassy and unfocused. The next, she let out a strangled gasp and crumpled to the floor. Paramedics were called. The school nurse tried to wake her, but Susan was unresponsive, her body shivering as if she were freezing. When she was rushed to the hospital, doctors gathered around her, puzzled. Her vitals were weak, and she had a dangerously high fever. But the real horror began when a nurse, attempting to examine her head, hesitated. Susan's bun was unnatural. The hair was so stiff, so fused together that it felt solid, like a shell. It took two nurses and a pair of scissors to even begin unraveling it, and then the screaming began. As they cut through the years of neglected hair, something inside moved. A writhing, slithering motion, and then they spilled out. Dark, glistening shapes, hundreds of them, tumbling onto the floor, scattering in all directions, cockroaches. Dozens upon dozens of cockroaches living inside Susan's hair. They had built nests within the tangled strands, laying eggs, burrowing deep into her scalp. Some were still alive, scurrying away in panic, their antennae twitching. Others had died and decayed, their carcasses tangled within the hair, merging with the filth. The smell of rot filled the hospital room, but that wasn't the worst part. Underneath the nest of roaches, Susan's scalp was raw and eroded, patches of flesh eaten away. In some places, bone was visible. The insects had been feasting on her. Doctors and nurses staggered back in horror. A young intern gagged. The attending physician immediately called the police. Susan's mother was arrested that evening for severe child neglect. When questioned, she coldly admitted that she hadn't washed her daughter's hair in over 6 years. She never noticed the infestation, never cared about Susan's pain. As for Susan, she survived, but she would never be the same. The trauma ran deeper than her scalp. The crawling sensation never fully left her, and to this day, she still wakes up in the middle of the night, feeling them moving, scuttling, whispering inside her mind. And sometimes she swears she hears them coming back. Susan survived, but survival didn't mean escape. The hospital kept her under observation for weeks, treating her wounds and monitoring her for infections. The doctors had never seen anything like it, the level of neglect, the sheer horror of it all. Some of them had nightmares for days, seeing those cockroaches spilling out of her hair, twitching and writhing like a living nightmare. But for Susan, the real nightmare had just begun. She no longer had hair. The doctors had shaved her scalp completely, removing the filth, the nests, the eggs. But even with her head bare, she still felt them. At night, she would wake up clawing at her skin, swearing she could feel something crawling beneath it. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her head, feeling phantom legs scuttling across her skull. She barely spoke when the nurses tried to comfort her. She just stared at them with empty eyes. But when she did speak, her voice was barely a whisper. "They're still there." The nurses would reassure her that no, they were gone. The doctors had removed them. She was safe. But Susan would only shake her head. "They whispered to me at night." At first, they thought it was trauma, a psychological wound left by years of suffering. But then the incidents started happening. It started with the nurse assigned to Susan's night shift. She was found unconscious in the hallway one morning, her body covered in angry red bites. Her lips were swollen, her skin pale, and when she was revived, she screamed about something crawling in her throat. Doctors found nothing inside her, but she insisted she felt them moving. She was sent home, and she never returned to work. Then a janitor complained about an unbearable scratching sensation on his arms. When he lifted his sleeves, small cockroach eggs were embedded in his skin. It made no sense. The hospital was pristine, sterilized, and routinely checked for pests. Yet the infestation continued, and it always happened near Susan's room. One night, a nurse walked in to check on her and froze. Susan was sitting on the hospital bed, completely still, her shaved head reflecting the dim light, but she wasn't alone. Dozens of cockroaches were crawling all over her. They slithered over her bare scalp, moving in and out of her hospital gown, their tiny legs caressing her pale skin. But she didn't flinch, she didn't scream. She just sat there, staring at the nurse. "They came back," she whispered. The nurse dropped the tray she was holding, the clatter echoing down the empty hallway. Susan smiled, and then she laughed. Not a normal laugh, a low, crawling, inhuman giggle that made the nurse's skin crawl. That was the last time anyone entered Susan's room alone. The doctors decided to transfer Susan to a psychiatric facility. They said she needed specialized care, but the truth was, they were terrified of her. The night before her transfer, a security guard was stationed outside her room. He had heard the rumors, the whispers among the staff. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but even he felt uneasy as he stood by her door. Then around 3 a.m., he heard something, a faint, wet skittering. His breath hitched. He turned, gripping his flashlight. The hallway was empty. But the sound grew louder, and then he saw them. A wave of cockroaches crawling toward him from the darkness. Thousands of them moving together like a single, writhing mass. And in the middle of them, Susan stood. Her bare feet didn't make a sound as she walked toward him, cockroaches pouring out of her sleeves, her mouth, her ears. She smiled, tilting her head. "They're hungry," she whispered. The guard barely had time to scream before the swarm engulfed him. By the time they found his body the next morning, there was nothing left but bones. And Susan, she was gone. Vanished. The only thing left in her empty hospital bed was a single cockroach sitting in the middle of her pillow, watching. Years later, urban legends spread about the roach girl, the child whose body had become a nest for the insects, the girl who disappeared without a trace. Some say she's still out there, walking through the streets at night, her voice a faint whisper in the dark. And if you ever feel something crawling on your skin in the dead of night, don't look, don't scream. Because she might be watching and she's still hungry.